Wake Island.
Wake Island is a coral atoll with a coastline of 12 miles just north of the Marshall Islands. It is an unorganized, unincorporated territory of the United States, administered by the Office of Insular Affairs, U.S. Department of the Interior. There are about 150 people living on its 2.85 square miles. Access to the island is restricted, and all activities on the island are managed by the United States Air Force. There is also a missile facility operated by the United States Army. The largest island, Wake Island, is the center of activity on the atoll and is the location of Wake Island Airfield, which has a 9,800-foot runway. On January 6, 2009, President George W. Bush included the atoll as a part of the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. For statistical purposes, Wake is grouped as one of the United States' minor outlying islands.
Geography.
Wake is located to the west of the International Dateline and sits in the Wake Island time zone, UTC+12, 1 day ahead of the 50 U.S. states, two-thirds of the way between Honolulu, 2,300 statute miles, 3,700 kilometers, to the east and Guam, 1,510 statute miles, 2,430 kilometers, to the west. The closest land is the uninhabited Bokak Atoll 348 miles to the southeast. Although Wake is officially called an island in the singular form, it is actually an atoll comprising 3 islands and a reef surrounding a central lagoon. Referring to the atoll as an island is the result of a pre-World War II desire by the United States Navy to distinguish Wake from other atolls, most of which were Japanese territory.
Climate.
Wake Island lies in the tropical zone, but it is subject to periodic temperate storms during the winter. Sea surface temperatures are warm all year long, reaching above 80 DEGF, 27 DEGC, in summer and autumn. Typhoons occasionally pass over the island.
Typhoons.
On September 16, 1967, at 10:40 p.m. local time, the eye of Typhoon Sarah passed over the island. Sustained winds in the eye wall were 130 knots, 241 km per hour, from the north before the eye, and from the south afterward. All non-reinforced structures were demolished. There were no serious injuries, and the majority of the civilian population was evacuated after the storm. On August 28, 2006, the United States Air Force evacuated all 188 residents and suspended all operations as Category 5 Super Typhoon Ayuk headed toward Wake. By August 31, the southwestern eye wall of the storm passed over the island, with winds well over 185 miles per hour, 298 kilometers per hour, driving a 20 feet, 6 m, storm surge and waves directly into the lagoon, inflicting major damage. A U.S. Air Force assessment and repair team returned to the island in September 2006 and restored limited function to the airfield and facilities, leading ultimately to a full return to normal operations.
History. Pre-European discovery.
Indigenous Marshallese oral tradition suggests that before European exploration, nearby Marshall Islanders traveled to what is now Wake Island, which the travelers called Anankio, Marshallese new orthography, Anankio, after a small orange shrub flower said to have been found on the atoll. In the ancient Marshallese religion, rituals surrounding the tattooing of tribal chiefs, called Iroalaplup, were done using fresh human bones, which required a human sacrifice. A man could save himself from being sacrificed if he obtained a wing bone from a very large seabird said to have existed on Anankio. Small groups would brave traveling to the atoll in hopes of obtaining this bone, saving the life of the potential human sacrifice. No evidence exists to suggest there was ever a permanent settlement by Marshall Islanders on Wake Island. Based upon oral tradition, along with concepts of first usage land rights commonly held in Micronesian cultures as legitimate for settling indigenous land disputes, a group of Marshall Island descendants formed the Kingdom of Anankio to claim ownership of Wake Island. The Marshall Islands and U.S. governments, who have competing claims to the island, vigorously deny this.
European and American discovery and exploration.
On October 20, 1568, Álvaro de Mendana, a Spanish explorer with 2 ships, Los Reyes and Todos los Santos, discovered a low barren island, judged to be 8 leagues in circumference, to which he gave the name of San Francisco. The island was eventually named for Captain William Wake, master of the British trading schooner, Prince William Henry, who visited in 1796. Jeremiah N. Reynolds' 1828 report to the U.S. House of Representatives describes Captain Edward Gardner's discovery of a 25-mile, 40 kilometers, long island situated at 19 Deg 15N, 166 Deg 32E, with a reef at the eastern edge when he was captain of the HMS Bellona in 1823. The island was covered with wood, having a very green and rural appearance, and, Reynolds concluded, was probably Wake Island. It was placed on charts by John Arrowsmith. On December 20, 1840, the United States exploring expedition, commanded by Commodore Charles Wilkes of the U.S. Navy, landed on Wake and surveyed the island. Wilkes described the atoll as a low coral one, of triangular form and 8 feet above the surface. It has a large lagoon in the center, which was well filled with fish of a variety of species. Among these was some fine mullet. He also noted that Wake had no fresh water but was covered with shrubs, the most abundant of which was the Tournefortia. The expedition's naturalist, Titian Peale, collected many new specimens, including an egg from a short-tailed albatross and various marine life specimens.
Wreck of the libel.
Wake Island first received international attention with the wreck of the bark Libel. On the night of March 4, 1866, the 650-ton Libel, of Bremen, Germany, struck the eastern reef of Wake Island during a gale. Commanded by Captain Tobias, the ship was en route from San Francisco to Hong Kong. Among its passengers were the English-born opera singer Anna Bishop. This occurred on the first leg of a world tour, her second husband Martin Schultz, a New York diamond merchant, and 3 other members of an English opera troupe. After 21 days on Wake, the 30 stranded passengers and crewmen sailed in a longboat and the gig for the then Spanish island of Guam. The longboat, containing the opera troupe, Schultz and other passengers, reached Guam on April 8. Unfortunately, the gig, commanded by the captain, was lost at sea. Captain Tobias had buried valuable cargo on Wake, including 1,000 flasks, 34,500 kilograms, of mercury, as well as coins and precious stones worth about $150,000. At least 5 ships conducted salvage operations for its recovery. The plight of the Libel's passengers and the buried cargo was reported by newspapers around the world.
American possession.
Brigadier General Francis Greene stopped at Wake in 1898 and raised the American flag while en route to the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. On January 17, 1899, Commander Taussig of the U.S. Navy landed on Wake and took possession of the island for the United States as a planned telegraph cable station. In 1935, Pan American Airways constructed a small village, nicknamed Parville, to service flights on its U.S.-China route. The village was the first human settlement on the island, and relied upon the U.S. mainland for much of its food and water supplies. However, Wake Island is credited as being one of the early successes of hydroponics, which enabled Pan American Airways to grow vegetables for its passengers, as it was prohibitively expensive to airlift in fresh vegetables and the island lacked natural soil. A major air and naval base was built in 1940-41. Parville remained in operation up to the day of the first Japanese air raid in World War II, see below.
Military buildup.
In January 1941, the United States Navy constructed a military base on the atoll. On August 19, the first permanent military garrison, elements of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, totaling 449 officers and men, were stationed on the island, commanded by Navy Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham. Also on the island were 68 U.S. naval personnel and about 1,221 civilian workers from the U.S. firm Morrison Knudsen Corporation. They were armed with 6 used 5-inch per 51 calibers, 127 mm, cannons, removed from a scrapped battleship. 12 3-inch per 50 calibers, 76.2 mm, M3 anti-aircraft guns, with only a single working anti-aircraft director among them. 18 Browning M2.50 caliber heavy machine guns. And 30 heavy, medium, and light, water or air-cooled Browning M1917.30 caliber machine guns in various conditions but all operational.
World War II. Battle of Wake Island.
On December 8, 1941, the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7 in Hawaii, which is on the other side of the international date line, at least 27 Japanese Mitsubishi G3M medium Nell bombers flown from bases on Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands attacked Wake Island, destroying 8 of the 12 F-4F Wildcat fighter aircraft belonging to United States Marine Corps Fighter Squadron 211, VMF-211, on the ground. The Marine garrison's defensive emplacements were left intact by the raid, which primarily targeted the aircraft. The garrison, supplemented by civilian construction workers employed by Morrison Knudsen Corporation, repelled several Japanese landing attempts. An American journalist reported that after the initial Japanese amphibious assault was beaten back with heavy losses on December 11, the American commander was asked by his superiors if he needed anything. The commander sent back the message, "Send us more Japs." A reply which became a popular legend. However, when Major James Deveray, USMC, learned after the war that he was credited with that message, he pointed out that contrary to reports he was not the commander on Wake Island and denied sending that message. "As far as I know, it wasn't sent at all. None of us was that much of a damn fool. We already had more Japs than we could handle." In reality, Commander Winfield S. Cunningham, USN, was in overall charge of Wake Island, not Deveray. Cunningham ordered that coded messages be sent during operations, and a junior officer had added "send us" and more Japs to the beginning and end of a message to confuse Japanese code breakers. This was put together at Pearl Harbor and passed on as part of the message. Cunningham and Deveray both wrote books about the battle and their Japanese imprisonment ordeal. Denied support from Hawaii, the isolated U.S. garrison was eventually overwhelmed by a reinforced and greatly superior Japanese invasion force on December 23. American casualties numbered 52 military personnel, Navy and Marine, and approximately 70 civilians killed. Japanese losses exceeded 700 dead, with some estimates ranging as high as 1,000. Wake's defenders sank 2 Japanese destroyers and 1 submarine, and shot down 24 Japanese aircraft. In the aftermath of the battle, most of the captured civilians and military personnel were sent to POW camps in Asia, though some of the civilian laborers were enslaved by the Japanese and tasked with improving the island's defenses. Captain Henry T. Elrod, USMC, one of the pilots from VMF-211, was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for shooting down 2 Japanese Zero fighters, sinking a destroyer and later fighting on foot, when his plane was destroyed, to defend the island. Many of his comrades were also highly decorated for their part in the fighting. The Wake Island device was created for American veterans of the battle to wear on their Navy or Marine Corps expeditionary medals.
Japanese occupation and surrender.
The island's Japanese garrison was composed of the IJN 65th Guard Unit, 2,000 men, Japan Navy Captain Shigematsu Sakabura, and the IJA units which became 13th Independent Mixed Regiment, 1,939 men, under command of Colonel Shigiji Chikamari. The Japanese-occupied island, called by the Motorishima, Dani or Dao, or Big Bird Island for its bird-like shape, was bombed several times by American aircraft. One of these raids was the first mission for future United States President George H. W. Bush. After a successful American air raid on October 5, 1943, Sakubra ordered the execution of all of the 98 captured Americans who remained on the island. They were taken to the northern end of the island, blindfolded, and machine-gunned. One prisoner escaped, carving the message 98 USPW May 10, 43 on a large coral rock near where the victims had been hastily buried in a mass grave. This unknown American was soon recaptured and beheaded. Sakubra and his subordinate, Lieutenant Commander Tarchai Bana, were later sentenced to death after conviction for this and other war crimes. Tarchai Bana's sentence was later commuted to life in prison. Shigematsu Sakubra was executed on June 18, 1947 on Guam. The remains of the murdered civilians were exhumed and reburied at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Section G. On September 4, 1945, the Japanese garrison surrendered to a detachment of United States Marines. The handover of Wake was conducted in a brief ceremony. After the war, a speckled granite memorial stone inscribed with the words, "The 98 Rock" / inscribed by an unknown POW, was attached to the 98 Rock. A bronze plaque nearby lists the names of the 98.
Post-war.
On October 15, 1950, U.S. President Harry S. Truman and General Douglas MacArthur met on Wake Island Conference, to confer about the progress of the Korean War. They chose to meet at Wake Island because of its closer proximity to Korea so that General MacArthur would not have to be away from the troops in the field for long. Subsequently, the island was used for strategic defense and operations during the Cold War. In 1952 or 1953, a young Chris Christopherson worked for a dredging contractor on the island. It was administered by the United States Army Space and Missile Defense Command, formerly known as the United States Army Space and Strategic Defense Command. Since 1974, Wake Island has served as a launch platform for military rockets involved in testing anti-missile systems and atmospheric re-entry trials. Launches take place from 19 Dec 1724 N166 Dec 3705E/19.29000 DEG N166.61806 DEG/19.29000 166.61806. In conjunction with the aerospace use, the island's airstrip, Wake Island Airfield, has been used by the U.S. military and some commercial cargo planes, as well as for emergency landings. There are over 700 landings of all types a year on the island. There are also 2 offshore anchorages for large ships. From late April until the middle of August 1975, Wake Island was used as a refugee camp for more than 8,000 Vietnamese refugees who fled their homeland after the fall of Saigon ended the Vietnam War with a communist victory. The island remains a strategic location in the North Pacific Ocean and serves as an emergency landing location for twin-engined ETOPS commercial trans-Pacific flights passing overhead. Some World War II facilities and wreckage remain on the island.
Protected statuses.
On September 16, 1985, the World War II-related resources on Peel, Wilkes, and Wake Islands were designated a National Historic Landmark. Preserving the remains of World War II items from the Battle of Wake Island was the goal of the designation. It is thereby also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. On January 16, 2009, Secretary of the Interior Dirk Kempthorne created Wake Island National Wildlife Refuge in consultation with the Air Force. The refuge covers a total of 495,515 acres, 2,005.28 kilometers (2), nearly all of which is submerged lands within 12 nautical miles, 22 kilometers, of the island. Under the refuge a rare grass species, Lepteris gasparicensis, is protected and the black-footed and Laysan albatrosses have been reintroduced. However, the one species endemic to Wake Island, the Wake Island rail, became extinct between 1942 and 1945 as a result of hunting for food by the large contingent of occupying Japanese troops. On January 6, 2009, President George W. Bush included the atoll as a part of the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument.
Territorial claim by the Marshall Islands.
The territorial claim by the Republic of the Marshall Islands on Wake Atoll leaves some ambiguity regarding the actual or hypothetical role of the U.S. military, responsible under agreement for the defense of Marshallese territory in the event of any strategic crisis or hostilities involving Wake. A small separatist group is known as the Kingdom of Enenkio also claims the island. However, the atoll was formally annexed by the United States at the end of the 19th century and is administered by the U.S. Department of the Interior's Office of Insular Affairs.
Popular cultural references.
Wake Island is a recurring map in the Battlefield first-person shooter series. It appears in Battlefield 1942, Battlefield 2, Battlefield 2142, Battlefield Heroes, Battlefield 1943 and Battlefield 3, as a principal game map. It also appears in the game War Thunder. In the 1999 PC game system Shock 2, Wake Island Station is a space station used by futuristic Marines. The Hollywood movie, Wake Island, 1942, starring Brian Donlevy, Robert Preston and MacDonald Carey, tells the story of the U.S. fight to hold the island from invading Japanese at the beginning of the Second World War. The Battle of Wake Island is also mentioned in Pulp Fiction, as the place where the grandfather of Butch Coolidge fought and died. It has been made into a workshop map in the game Company of Heroes 2 Feet. This is playable online and in skirmish